In the first part of this conversation, I gave an introduction to the Global Collections Initiative aims and activities, and just to bring that slide up again, those principal activities were to forge partnerships to support access, to create apparati for access to primary source collections, and to look at the archiving practices of institutions as they relate to born digital resources. The first bullet point here is a key component of the Global Collections Initiative. We see this not just as a North American initiative, but a way to bridge the interests of research institutions across the world, both within the global north that have long built legacy collections to these materials and continue to support the research, but also in the global south, where active research and development of new resources, both in print and born digital, are happening on a daily basis. Within the international partnerships focus, again here, we were looking along very similar themes in the digitization realm in terms of identifying appropriate partners to work with CRL and its community of member libraries to support non-commercial efforts to make data and information openly accessible, as well as looking at the tools and practices of libraries in terms of licensing for e-resources where non-commercial options are available. So looking at licensing opportunities and some of the tools and analysis that are required to help further identify and approach the licensing of those resources themselves. I'm just going to highlight a couple of those, couple of the partnership activities that we undertook during the course of this event, during this program, to demonstrate some of the areas, some of these areas in terms of what we were looking to do. First, we recently highlighted a large program that was undertaken by CRL in cooperation with a number of institutions that came together under the Global Collections Initiative. I mentioned one of our partner institutions was the Colegio de Mexico, which is a fantastic institution that has done a lot of documentation and work with organizations in Mexico to collect and study current events that are happening in Mexico. In tandem with Northwestern University and Article 19, which is a civil society organization, CRL came together to collect and host a body of material that was truly at risk. The Mexican Intelligence Digital Archives was an initiative with Northwestern's Professor Paul Gillingham and a variety of colleagues in Mexico as well as the United States, looking at the availability of the archives of Mexico's two principal security agencies, the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, or DFS, as well as its successor organization. The resources from these security services were archives on the surveillance and close interrogation of a variety of individuals in Mexico, as well as some of the intelligence gathered on international figures as well. These materials were handed over to the National Archives in Mexico and for a brief period were made accessible for consultation to researchers. Citing security concerns, the archives closed those records, but not before many researchers had the opportunities to consult those archives. And in many cases, those researchers were taking notes, snapping cell phone pictures, or making photocopies from those collections as well. So once the materials were restricted and no longer available to scholars, a group of concerned scholars came together to crowdsource, effectively, the documentation that was contained in those archives. Principal among them was a noted scholar, Sergio Aguayo, in Mexico, one of whose collections exists right now in Midas. This effort, supported by CRL, was undertaken through the initiative because of the intense scholarly interest in this material. there was a need to host this material, but also concern that if it were hosted in Mexico, that might draw the ire of the government on a Mexican institution themselves. So CRL volunteered to take on the hosting of this material. All told, the digital archive will eventually include up to 300,000 plus documents from the Mexican intelligence services spanning the 1940s to the 1980s. As of now, there's still a limited quantity of the materials that are up online, but our technical services team has been working to receive and ingest ongoing metadata and images from the principals in this initiative, and we'll be making those materials available over time. We've already substantially upgraded the existing collections that we have in the archive, whereas previously we were just receiving images. We've been able to process those materials for full-text searchability and cross-searchability across the collections. It should be noted, as a note of caution for those jumping into this, that a number of these documents have been marked up in pencil, been stamped over multiple times by agencies, and so the OCR is far from perfect within this collection. This is why the principals on the MIDAS project are working to create more extensive metadata that one can use to filter and discover materials within this resource. Fitting into the objectives of the Global Collections Initiative also is the work that CRL has been doing in partnership with Eastview Information Services on the Global Press Archive. One of the primary interests that we heard from our member institutions was on the increased availability of news in electronic format, and in particular news beyond the cutoff of United States copyright laws. So materials from 1924 forward are of voracious interest to scholars at member institutions. But the challenges and difficulty of arranging for access to those materials has proven thus far largely insurmountable to the academic library environment itself. Eastview Information Services signed a partnership with the Stanford University and to digitize the collection of print newspapers from the Hoover Institution. All told, Hoover holds well over 25 million pages of newspapers from China, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and other areas of conflict that were of principal interest to the institution and its scholars. CRL brokered a partnership with Eastview in order to make those materials accessible to all CRL members. And more importantly, as part of this conversation and the push towards open access collections, a substantial portion of the materials that has been supported by CRL and neural institutions will be made available as open access collections worldwide. Just yesterday, we announced the release of the very first collection of the Global Press Archive Charter Alliance support from CRL institutions, and you can find information on our website as well as on Eastview's website about this collection. The first open access collection centers on late Qing and Republican-era Chinese newspapers. So broadly speaking, newspapers from the period around 1912 through October of 1949, with the beginning of the People's Republic. These resources, again, from the initial source list from the Hoover Institution, but augmented by the holdings of institutions, including CRL and other member libraries, are being compiled and digitized to make these materials widely available, whereas previously many or most of these titles were not available in any format whatsoever beyond print or perhaps microfilm. This preliminary release is closing in around 200,000 pages at this time. Ultimately, this collection will feature about 500,000 pages of content. And here you can see the brand new interface that has been developed by Eastview for the Global Press Archive. And you can see the URL at the bottom of the screen here and go to consult this on your own. It features full functionality, including searching in Chinese characters, the ability to filter by title, by date, by location, and navigate through these resources. So the preliminary release just happened, and we will be working to complete the full digitization of this collection in the coming few months, but most of the content is already in production at Eastview itself, and they're continually rolling out new content into this. CRL will eventually receive all of the images and metadata for this material, and we'll be able to make that available also on our platform and for consultation for those seeking full-text resources for academic computing. We'll also be receiving, for those who are wondering, metadata and MARC records for all the titles in here, and we will be providing those on request or making them available to all CRL member institutions to include in your catalog and in your database lists. So this is breaking news, and we're very happy to share this news with you. One other partnership I want to briefly highlight in progress is working with the Fundación Getulio Vargas, I mentioned, is one of the partners within the Global Collections Initiative, and particularly in the department, the Center for Research and Documentation of Contemporary Brazilian History, CPDOC. The center has extensive collections of personal archives from noted luminaries throughout Brazil's contemporary history, including politicians, ministry officers, social movement actors, and the like. And their collection of some 3 million pages of these personal archives are gradually being digitized by the Center for Research and Documentation, by CPDOC. One of the areas that has received comparatively little attention, however, in the archives have been the archives of women that are held in the collection themselves. The debate on women's role in public life is becoming more and more relevant, not just in Brazil, of course, but across the world. And the materials that have been collected by CPDOC may represent only a small fraction of the entire collections of materials that they hold. But they're an important piece and a missing voice, I think, in the study of Brazil's contemporary history. CPDOC approached CRL for some modest funding in order to make those collections available. And as of about 3 weeks ago, we signed an agreement for them to begin the work on the digitization and markup of these archives. The one you see on the screen is a collection description from Ana Amelia de Quiroz Carneiro de Mendonça. I'm really going to mess that one up. Mendonça, who's a Brazilian poet, feminist activist, and an important voice from the mid-20th century. They're making those collections available. You can look for more information on their site and on social media, and we'll be glad to publicize more of this activity when it's available. I want to just step back briefly and mention one mechanism by which we're looking to aggregate information about all of these activities. Through the Global Collections Initiative, CRL has built and is putting through its paces an online platform for aggregating information about collections, data sets of interest to international studies, suggestions from our member institutions for potential projects called Global Collections. And the work of the Area Materials Projects, or the AMPs, have been recently using this to put up its proposals that they consider each year for digitization or preservation. They've been using it quite well, I think, and we're ready to implement this across a broader community of libraries with their useful feedback on this. So you can just see here some of the a teaser for this, and when we make a broader announcement to this, you'll be able to dig in and see what collections have been proposed or approved, and eventually materials that are fully reformatted and accessible to the audience. Lastly, we've socialized an idea over several forums that I wanted to bring up again here as a potential area for future member support. Census materials that have been aggregated over time by libraries in North America are, broadly speaking, not electronically available. And where they may exist in electronic format, they are certainly not in any sort of format or shape from which scholars could make use of the statistical data and the wealth of information that are in those materials. We've talked in the past with this community about work together with the IPRMS group that's part of the Minnesota Population Center. IPRMS stands for the Integrated Public Use Microdata Series, and many of you have heard us talk about and with them about the work that they're doing in terms of cleaning and making data files accessible, open access to researchers worldwide. We've had a number of conversations about the potential for identifying and aggregating national level census information across Latin America as part of our initiative. And we've worked to assemble a reasonably comprehensive list of all of the census rounds across countries in Latin America. And we're developing further information about the number of volumes, pages, and the potential scope of what it would take to make these materials electronically accessible. The conceived proposal as it stands right now would be done in stages, including fully scanning the print publications, making those OCR'd as high a quality as possible, and putting those materials up as open access collections would be the first phase. The second phase would be to work to computerize mechanisms to encode the tabular data series within those. That would require a much larger and perhaps time-intensive effort to make that tabular data available. But IPRMS has been developing the technology and the practices in order to make that happen, and we think they stand to succeed if the community so desires to see this happen. And thirdly, some recent conversations with the other side of Eastview Geospatial, has brought some ideas around how we can make this material GIS enabled for advanced research purposes. Eastview has recently launched a fledgling program on Latin American census materials, and they've aggregated census collections, the most recent census from, I believe, every country in Latin America, and they've added a GIS element to those and present those as data sets to researchers. And I know a number of CRL institutions have begun working with them on receiving that data for research purposes. We think there's an opportunity here for all of these pieces to fit together, and we're looking to develop a proposal in consultation with our collections committees here at CRL and to socialize this further with you and with your colleagues. To see if we can conceive of a global census archive, much along the lines of the Global Press Archive. I'd welcome your feedbacks privately or publicly here in this forum about your interests or questions that you might have about that. But I just wanted to park that out there in this update as an area of future interest. So in closing to this section, I wanted to talk again about the priorities and lessons learned that we learned during the development phase of the Global Collections Initiative from 2016 to 2019. Certainly these are reflective of the priorities that I mentioned in the first segment on enabling electronic access to materials, because many of these streams ultimately flow back and forth with each other, whether it's working with partners, supporting unique partnerships with commercial providers, supporting non-commercial providers, and looking at born digital activities. All of these things merge together in ways that we find exciting and challenging. We need to mobilize libraries to be, a broader mechanism of support for providers of data that are of interest to researchers on our campuses today and in the future. A growing amount of primary source documentation, economic data, government records, NGO publications are produced electronically, and they have no print counterpart. To date, there have been very few and only small-scale attempts to identify, navigate, capture, and preserve that born digital material. Moreover, much of the data that's collected towards producing publicly disseminated information are stored in formats by organizations that are not built for long-term sustainability. We should be looking for ways to provide collective support to those most important institutions that are aggregating this data and making it accessible. News media, for example, is another area where insufficient efforts have been made to sustain the born digital systems and processes in place that collect it and make that news available to users today, especially for those down the line in the future. We took a landscape analysis of important current documentation and data providers on the web with a focus on Latin America as part of our study, and looked at the threats to the long-term accessibility. In particular, we looked at organizations that were gathering and attempting to preserve that important data. And we worked with a consultant who's quite a worthy connection within Latin America, was John Slocum. He looked at how web content and web functionality has evolved, and how institutions in Mexico in particular were responding by storing electronic information and producing it out on the web. Through that landscape analysis, we became convinced that some key service organizations in the regions, those collecting human rights data, those collecting journalistic evidence and producing the data sets for discovery and for news purposes, these organizations could use more support, and at the very least have partnerships with institutions in the region to provide safe haven for that data that they're collecting and longevity. CRL could help coordinate those by providing a forum for opening up knowledge and information about what they're doing, and connect them to researchers and connect them to institutions that could perhaps help them. And in some cases, work directly with them on sustained projects through the support of the community of libraries here in North America. And again, here, a priority for us in partnering and leveraging these partnerships is promoting open and equitable models of access, exposing the terms of public-private partnerships that are out there, working with the commercial providers to encourage an end date to exclusive and locked down access are important aspects of the work here. And when working with our non-commercial and academic partners, ensuring that these materials are made accessible to a wide audience is an important principle of the work in order to generate these public goods. And finally, moving back to information gathering and collectivizing our collective intelligence, like Amy was talking about earlier, continuing to expand the tools, the data, the analysis services that CRL provides in order to enable partner consortia and individual libraries deal effectively with vendors and data sources of materials that are being produced today. Many of you were with us in October 2016 at our first eDesiderta forum, where we looked at the challenges of licensing and accessing global data. These challenges were further explored at CRL's 2018 Global Resources Forum. And in general, in these areas, we found that statistical, geospatial, economic data, these are territories that are not well mapped and understood. And we looked to provide terms and guidelines for licensing of data resources, licensing and acquiring data resources. That's up on our website. We think that these are areas of continued interest in working together with understanding the different needs of institutions in the UK or in Europe or in Latin America, and in these areas could be fruitful areas for CRL to continue to explore and work. So working on these continued and complex problems in support of ultimate access to research resources on behalf of our scholars is an important component of the work of the Global Collections Initiative. And we hope to work seriously with you and your scholars and your librarians in the future to further expand the activities of the initiative. We have time for just a question or two, I believe, and we'll certainly welcome all here or in follow-up. One comment that came through was talking about some of the challenges of if I'm characterizing this correctly, kind of getting our arms around the universe of information that's out there. There are a lot of small providers that hold pieces of data and documentation, and they want to hold those close. They want to make it accessible, but they also need to protect that information because that's their identity. And that's, in some cases, the aggregation of that information would be the power, and that there are organizations out there that are doing that they're creating tools and interfaces to enhance the access and make those materials easily accessible. And so there's a competing need here in terms of providing the types of aggregation services and the interfaces to make these materials available. And is that best done with a commercial partner? Is that best done as a community ourselves? These are, in fact, ongoing challenges. We need to think about ways that we can work with each other and with the organizations to bring this data together in ways that best promote the open and equitable access of those materials as well. Oh, and one further comment about how can we enlist other institutions in this effort beyond just CRL. This is something that we also heard from a number of our evaluators of the program. We did consult with a number of faculty, librarians, other organizations about the work, and everybody said, well, we're all trying to tackle the similar challenges. We're all trying to make sure that material is accessible. How can we work better together? For instance, how can we make how can we work with the national libraries on this? How can we work with our shared national infrastructure, such as OCLC or HathiTrust, to make sure that this material is discoverable and accessible? Do we need to figure out new models of partnerships or expand the thinking of some of these existing organizations in order to make these materials available and accessible? So that's an important point here, is bringing like-minded organizations together in support of this. If there are additional questions or comments, please do send them to either me or to Amy. Our contact information is on the screen here, and I believe Virginia is just going to wrap this up. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James. Thanks to James and Amy. And as James mentioned, please continue to give your feedback to each of them about the topics they've covered today. Thank you all for attending today. I'd like to just briefly remind you of upcoming events. That first one, that should be eDesiderta Forum. Our big annual virtual forum, which is coming up next month at the end of October. And each year we look at issues involved with assessing and providing reasonable access to databases, particularly large data resources. And this year we'll be looking through the lens of the various consortia. And CRL and NERL hope to gain insights from representatives of some of the major consortia on successful approaches to help improve member engagement and serve member interest in leveraging the power of the membership in negotiations with providers of content. And we will have presenters from CRKN, from JISC, from NERL, and from two law library representative groups, the Law and Business, Academic Business Library Directors and American Association of Law Libraries. So that is coming up on the 30th. And that, as you will recall from previous years, is a lengthy virtual presentation. You'll find the times on CRL's website. It's from 12 o'clock noon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Central Time. We will not be providing recordings of all the presentations. As in previous years, we hope to really encourage real-time participation from all of those who are registered for the forum. Then looking ahead further to spring of 2020, it will be time again in Chicago for the annual Council of Voting Members on which is slated for Thursday, the 23rd of April, followed by a Global Resources Collections Forum on the 23rd and the 24th. We will be posting more details soon. Registration should open early in the year in 2020, and that will be held here in Chicago in April. As you leave the presentation today, we do hope you could take a little time to fill out our exit survey. This is very important to us, influencing our future programming. We want to be responsive to your interests. The recordings of these presentations today will be available on CRL's YouTube channel, and we will notify all registrants when those are available. As always, please keep up with us through information on our website. We hope that you are subscribed to our e-newsletter Connect, and you can engage with us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you very much.